So as you celebrate Brooklyn and you look at this exhibit, just keep in mind that this event is much larger than the borough itself. This event in 1968 is not just a national, but it was also an international sensation. 68 is an extremely important year. Lots of things are taking place. In the 1960s, the Reverend Milton Glamerson told me when I interviewed him, he said, hey, the 60s, 1960s, that was a long decade. And of course, 1968 is key. And lots of things going on internationally as well as nationally, the rise of course, the Black Power movement, as well as the anti-war movement at its height. So this incident that took place in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, was part of that larger national and international narrative. Now, before I begin to talk about the strike itself, I just want to also give a shout out to Mr. Brian Merlis. There you go. My first book, The Black Churches of Brooklyn, which was my dissertation, Brian was pivotal in helping me with that work because he has a monumental collection of Brooklyn. And he invited me into his home to look at almanacs and other material. So, and he has published a number of books on Brooklyn photographs. Many of those photographs out here are, they came from Brian Merlis. So thank you for your work, Brian.
Thank you.
Now, turning to this event in Brooklyn, for those who are not aware of it, let me just briefly talk about it. In 1967, the New York City Board of Education, along with the liberal Republican mayor, that sounds crazy today, but the liberal Republican mayor, John Lindsay, also along with the Ford Foundation, decided to endeavor on an experiment to give parents more say in operating the schools in their community. After a long struggle to integrate the schools of New York City, which Glamerson was a key leader in that struggle, that movement fell apart because of huge resistance from the New York City Board of Education, the many white parents in New York City, in particular Brooklyn and in Queens, and lack of support from important institutions like the United Federation of Teachers. So after that struggle, parents said, well, we cannot integrate the schools if these forces are not going to integrate the schools, then we are simply going to have to take charge of our children's education. For parents, they knew this was fighting to save their children's lives. The children were devastated by the school system, and they knew that they were on the path to failure. So they said, we need to step in and take control. And so many community activists, many civil rights leaders began to call for community control. And eventually, these forces, the mayor of New York, along with the Ford Foundation, said, well, let's set up experimental districts to try out this community control, which was really not community control. It was more of a decentralization, giving parents some leeway, some power. And 3 districts were established, one in Harlem, one in Lower Manhattan, the third one in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, Brooklyn. And it's in that district where all hell broke loose. When the school board itself did manage to hire what they called a unit administrator, a superintendent, a man by the name of Rhodey McCoy, and they decided that we are going to define community control. We are not going to allow the New York City Central Board to do it or anyone else. What we mean by community control is having control over the curriculum, having control over the budget, and of course having control over the personnel. This means hiring and firing of teachers. And in 1968, in the spring of 1968, the school board voted to dismiss 13 teachers and 5 administrators from the district. And the letter from the president of the school board was clear. They were to be sent to report to the central board for reassignment because the school board the local school board really didn't have the power to fire teachers. But the most powerful non-uniform union in the city, the United Federation of Teachers, some 67,000 strong, objected, and its president, a man by the name of Albert Schenker, made it clear. He said those teachers are not placed back in the schools. He says, I'm going to essentially shut down the entire system, have 1 million children, and just close down the system. And Schenker made the argument it is a matter of due process. Teachers need due process as a fundamental right of unions. And of course, he was true to his word when the school district refused to allow the teachers back into the school, into the districts, and Schenker then called a strike. Now, it was essentially 3 strikes that took place. And I'm not going to go into all the detail. I mean, if you would bring it up during the question and answer period, we can. One of the longest teacher strikes in American history, a very contentious strike. And it is right from there that we get the dominant narrative, and this narrative has been essentially the narrative that people hear. It's been written by scholars. You see it in documentaries on the New York City teachers' strike in 1968. So that many writing on the conflict between teachers' unions and African Americans argue that such conflict was rooted in the politics of the 1960s. Writer Jonathan Kaufman turns to New York in the 1960s, arguing that conditions had changed for blacks and Jews. So it's important to also understand this is a predominantly black and Latino community. The teachers' unions, the membership was predominantly Jewish. And so Kaufman argues that, quote, Jews weren't happy with the rising militancy and anti-white sentiment animating from the more militant parts of the civil rights movement. According to Kaufman, the rising black militancy was demanding power, real power. It was the rise of black militancy with such figures as Rhodey McCoy, Sonny Carson, and Les Campbell of the Afro-American Teachers Association, and openly, according to Kaufman, an openly anti-Semitic organization was at the root of the problem in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. Historian Joshua Zeitz argues that New York City black activists missed the mark. Instead of addressing those who were responding for neighborhood segregation, who were responsible for neighborhood segregation, such as those in banking and in real estate, parent and community activists turned on teachers. As, quote, as grassroots activists began gathering momentum for community control, they grew increasingly casual in their use of such terms as, quote, educational genocide. I think that was one of the signs there that come up. And intellectual colonialism, reflecting a growing consensus among movement leaders that their cause was at one with anti-colonial struggles in the Third World. Such attacks on a predominantly Jewish teaching force were bound to result in exaggeration and conflict as it did. Now, Richard Kallenberg, the author of a biography on Al Sharpton, Al Shanker, has been one of the most vocal advocates of the thesis that Black power, as manifested in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville conflict, was responsible for the destruction of what he calls the liberal consensus that brought us major gains in civil rights and labor. According to Kallenberg, liberalism stood for school integration and not racial segregation. It advocated the right to organize, and hiring should be based on merit and not race. And he noted that one of the biggest advocates of this notion of liberalism was Al Shanker, who he referred to as one of the greatest civil rights leaders of the time. He attended the 1963 March on Washington, supported the Selma March, and backed a civilian complaint review board in New York City in 1966. Civil rights groups and labor unions forged a powerful coalition, national and in New York City. But it was the portrayal of this liberal consensus by Black power that turned their backs on core liberal principles such as racial integration, merit-based hiring, labor unions, and the right to organize, and labor's right to due process. So as you can see, I'm just giving you examples of scholars who have made this argument that it is 1968, the rise of Black power, that has destroyed this, what Kallenberg calls liberal consensus. Now the problem with this thesis that Black power and Ocean Hill-Brownsville were responsible for the decline in the alliance between a pro-civil rights labor union and Black and Latino people is that it ignores an earlier history of the failure of the conflict between teachers and Black and Latino parents. In particular, the New York City Teachers Guild, and later, the United Federation of Teachers. Now, let me just a word. The New York City Teachers Guild was formed in 1936, when it broke away from the communist-dominated teachers union. And I argue in a book, Reds at the Blackboard, this break led to the contest between which type of unionism was going to dominate in the city and clearly the nation. The New York City Teachers Union, the communist-run, operated union, pushed the type of teacher unionism that was extremely broad. It took on the issues of Black and Latino communities, the communities in which teachers served. So it wasn't just improving the working conditions, it wasn't just fighting for better pay, higher wages, it was not just a matter of attempting to improve benefits. Instead, this union said we need to take on the issues that are ravaging the Harlem community, the Bed-Stuy community, later the Brownsville community. The Teachers Guild was militant, but it had a more narrow vision of unionism. It was militant in fighting for the rights of teachers, but it had very little connection with the Black and Latino communities that it served. And so I note a few examples of this. You know, right at its beginning, the formation of the Teachers Guilds in 1936, it was in a confrontation with the Harlem community over a principal by the name of Gustav Schoenchen, a principal of a elementary school, PS5 in Harlem. And on October 21st, 1936, 14-year-old Robert Sheldon escorted his cousin to her first grade class in the school. The historical record is not clear about the events that followed, but Sheldon claimed that he was beaten by Schoenchen across the head and arms with a stick. The Permanent Committee of Harlem Schools, made up of parents, activists, and members of the communist-dominant teachers union, called for the removal of the principal. 2 physicians examined the 14-year-old and wrote in an affidavit that there were contusions on his left forearm, about the wrist, and there were essentially fractures on his elbow. Sheldon also had contusions on his left shoulder. Now, while the teachers union and the Harlem community were calling for the dismissal of this principal, the new union, the Guild, was critical of both the TU and the Harlem activists. They accused the TU of, quote, promoting a highly prejudiced handling of the case. They blamed the so-called Committee for Better Schools in Harlem for circulating an, quote, alleged statement of facts accusing the principal of brutality of beating this 14-year-old. The committee, quote, caused an emotional outburst and prejudging of the principal, and condescending language in what was clearly insulting to Harlem residents. The Guild claimed a crowd of, quote, overwrought persons at the trial helped to create an impression that Principal Schoenchen was guilty. The Guild ridiculed the committee for passing out leaflets calling for mass action and asserting that Schoenchen must go. One handout even labeled Schoenchen a savage child beater. The Guild even questioned the severity of Sheldon's injuries, noting that although photos showed him covered in bandages, the boy was in bed only during the normal sleeping hours. In an inflammatory statement, the Guild declared that demonstrations were conducted by white leaders with a following of Negro children from the school. The Guild used the tactic of Southern racists who blamed Jews and communists for manipulating ignorant blacks. Accusing the teachers union of creating hostility between principals and teachers and promoting racial tension, the Guild called on its members to, quote, guard against race riots and against class war. The Guild statement revealed an attitude toward black communities that was disturbing. It brushed off the grievances that black parents had of school officials. The fact that the Guild was silent about the school's parent demeanor, an indication of how far it was divorced from that community. Instead, in its publication, the Guild portrayed Harlem residents as noted, overwrought, too ignorant to understand the reason why their children were failing in school and easily manipulated by white leftists. And it also ignored earlier criticisms of this principle by parents. Now, in 1941, I should note, responding to newspaper reports on a wave of crime, youth crime, the Guild issued a program combating juvenile delinquency, calling for reducing class size to 25, building new schools in ghetto areas, creating of adult education classes, extending of child guidance and social services as an integral part of the schools, industrial training in effort to address job insecurity. Now, these were fine demands by the Guild. But one point, of course, really irritated Black and Latino parents, and this was put out by the Guild's Problem Areas Committee. And essentially, it did call for recreational facilities, but it also noted that the problem in Harlem and other Black communities in New York was essentially pathological families. This whole idea to rehabilitate the Black and Latino communities was pushed by the Guild. That the problem isn't really the integration, that's really not the problem. The problem simply is that we have kids that are out of control in the classroom, and we need to address this. The Guild even went as far as to argue that we should have more police officers in the school, and that we should remove kids that are simply too troublesome to handle. Now, the Guild would stay firm on that theme even during the height of the civil rights movement in the nation and, of course, in New York City. One of the things that we ignore when studying the civil rights movement is the national reach of that movement. The civil rights movement was not just located in the South, but in other communities throughout the nation, including New York City. In fact, New York City had the fiercest civil rights struggle. That struggle, of course, would lead to the largest demonstration, civil rights demonstration of that period in 1964, and close to 500,000 children were kept out of the public schools to force the New York City Board of Education to come up with a timetable and a plan to integrate the schools. But early on, when civil rights organizations were